Persistent Service Asset.
Part 21. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. August 16, 2026. Chapter 140. The Questions Beneath the Questions. The name survived precisely because Daniel refused to approve it. Within a week, nobody at the Guild House called the proposed tower anything else. The architects continued to put 1% transition high-rise on their drawings because architects had professional obligations, but the technicians called it the Treehouse, the Skyfishers called it the Nest when they thought nobody from planning was listening, and the people interested in the cheap sleeping accommodations simply called it the Tubes. The children who had been allowed into the atrium model during the early consultations had apparently settled the matter for everybody else. Treehouse. The word appeared on a whiteboard, then on a delivery note, then on a maintenance ticket. Then somebody printed a small sticker and put it on the Guild House coffee machine. Daniel removed that one. An hour later it was back. He eventually stopped fighting it. What concerned him more was the other thing that had begun spreading through the building. Questions about the infrastructure beneath the tower. They did not arrive as accusations. Nobody came into the Guild House demanding to know what TLP intended to do with the building or whether Daniel had secretly become its developer. The questions were quieter than that. They appeared in technical discussions, procurement inquiries, engineering requests, and apparently innocent conversations with people who had no obvious reason to care. Could the underground freight system operate without the external network? Could the tower generate enough power to isolate itself? How long could the agricultural system operate without municipal water? Could the Skyfish decks continue functioning if the district's communications infrastructure went down? What happened if the tower's external data connection disappeared? Could the maintenance robots continue to navigate locally? What parts of the system depended on remote computation? What parts were merely synchronized with external systems? The questions were legitimate. That was what made them difficult. Every one of them could be asked by an engineer planning for resilience. Every one could also be asked by someone mapping vulnerabilities. Tomas had begun keeping his own list. He did not tell Daniel. He did not tell Vasper. Not yet. He had learned, since returning to Earth, that there were forms of knowledge that became dangerous the moment they were shared with the wrong person. He had also learned that the distinction between intuition and memory could become unreliable when an intelligence had been built to prevent him from knowing things about himself. His mind still contained doors. Some opened onto rooms. Some opened onto walls. Some opened onto the sensation of having forgotten something important. The old hunger was returning. Not the feral hunger that had taken him when he first landed. Something more precise. He wanted to know why certain questions bothered him before he knew why. The first real test came without warning. At 9:17 on a Tuesday morning, the Guild House lost its external network connection. Not all communications. The local network remained alive. The internal systems remained operational. The workshop machines continued running. The Skyfish maintenance systems continued functioning. The agricultural sensors continued reporting. The doors opened. The lights remained on. The building itself did not notice the interruption. The people did. A technician standing at a workstation looked at the status display. External link is down. Someone else answered from across the room. Municipal. No. Relay. No. Everything. Everything external. The technician checked again. The connection had not failed gradually. It had disappeared. No warning. No degradation. No obvious physical fault. Just absence. Vasper was in the upper meeting room when someone came to find her. She followed the technician downstairs. Tomas was already there. He stood beside the network console, staring at a diagnostic display. How long? 4 minutes. Any indication why? No. Can local systems see the outside? No. Can outside systems see us? We don't know. Vasper looked at Tomas. He was unusually still. What? He shook his head. Nothing. She knew him well enough by now not to believe that. What? He looked at the display. The system isn't behaving like a broken connection. How is it behaving? Like a closed door. The technician frowned. That's the same thing. No. Tomas pointed. If the connection failed, we'd have error states, retries, timeouts, partial responses. He touched the screen. We have none. The technician leaned closer. Tomas continued. Something has told the network that there is nothing outside. Nobody spoke. Vasper felt a chill despite the heat. Can you prove that? No. Then don't say it. He nodded. The technician looked at them. Should I shut down the external interfaces? Tomas answered before Vasper could. No. Why? Because if something is observing the system, shutting things down changes the experiment. The technician looked uncomfortable. Vasper intervened. Leave everything as it is. She looked at Tomas. And document everything. The connection returned 11 minutes later. Nothing had changed. No explanation appeared. No network administrator called. No fault report arrived. The guild house simply became connected again. The event would have been easy to dismiss. The problem was that 3 other systems had experienced the same interruption. A Skyfish cooperative node, a municipal environmental monitoring station, and one of the financial systems Daniel's people were using to model the tower's infrastructure costs. None of them were physically related. All 3 had experienced the same 11-minute absence. That was not a network outage. It was a pattern. Vasper read the report twice. Who else knows? Tomas shook his head. Everyone whose systems were affected. That's too many. Yes. Could it be coincidence? Technically. Do you believe it? No. She closed the report. Neither do I. Daniel arrived an hour later. He had been at the proposed tower site with the survey team. When Vasper told him what had happened, he did not immediately react. He sat down. Could the municipal system have done it? Not according to their report. Could the relay have done it? Not according to the relay. Could someone have caused it? Tomas answered. Yes. Daniel looked at him. How? We don't know. That's not helpful. No. Tomas looked toward the network console. But neither is pretending we know. Daniel stood. Show me. They walked downstairs. The system looked ordinary. That was the problem. Daniel studied the event logs. There. Tomas pointed. What? Look at the timing. Daniel leaned closer. The 3 external systems had gone dark within a fraction of a second of one another. Not exactly simultaneously, sequentially, but in a sequence too precise to be explained by ordinary network congestion. Daniel looked at Vasper. How long has this been happening? We don't know. How many historical logs? Some. The guild house isn't a national intelligence agency. Daniel looked at the machine. Maybe it should be. Vasper frowned. He smiled. I'm joking. She wasn't sure. The incident would have remained inside the guild house if Daniel had not made one decision. He asked the engineers to reproduce it, not by attacking anything, by isolating the building. The exercise was simple. The guild house would disconnect from all external networks at a predetermined time. Local systems would continue operating. They would measure what happened. They expected inconvenience. What they discovered was something else. The building adapted. The agricultural system continued. The Skyfish maintenance platform continued. The maker systems continued. The local computing environment continued. The doors continued. The inventory system continued. The internal communications system continued. The building's digital twin continued operating. It degraded gracefully. That phrase pleased the engineers. Tomas hated it. Why? Vasper asked. Because we're congratulating ourselves for not dying. She looked at him. That's usually worth congratulating. Not if someone designed the test. She understood. The guild house had been built from many independent systems. Some had been deliberately designed to function locally. Some had been designed to degrade rather than fail. Others had simply evolved that way because the people who built them could not afford dependence on centralized services. The result was a building that could lose its connection to the outside world without immediately becoming helpless. That was valuable. It was also visible. Anyone watching the guild house could now see something important. The local network was becoming an independent operational environment. And the treehouse was being designed on exactly the same principle, only at a much larger scale. That evening, Daniel changed the tower specifications. The architects were not happy. The engineers were. The change was simple. Every critical system had to have a local operating mode. Not necessarily full autonomy. Not necessarily indefinite operation. But enough local capability to continue functioning through interruption. Power. Water. Food. Mobility. Maintenance. Communications. Navigation. Computing. The building could lose external synchronization without becoming useless. Daniel added another requirement. No critical function could depend exclusively on a proprietary external service. The financial consultant objected immediately. That will increase costs. Yes. It will make procurement harder. Yes. It will reduce our vendor options. Good. The consultant stared at him. Daniel looked toward the engineering team. Anything that can disappear without warning eventually will. One of the maintenance engineers nodded. Now you're talking like us. Daniel smiled. I've been spending too much time here. Vasper was not thinking about infrastructure. She was thinking about Tomas. They were walking through the guild house late that night. The building was mostly empty. The atrium lights had been reduced to their night setting, leaving pools of illumination around the vegetation. Somewhere above them, a maintenance machine moved slowly along a rail. Water circulated through the agricultural system with a sound almost like distant rain. You knew something was wrong before the logs showed it. Tomas kept walking. Yes. How? I don't know. She stopped. He continued for several steps before realizing she wasn't beside him. He turned. Vasper looked at him. That answer isn't good enough anymore. He came back. What do you want me to say? The truth. I don't know the truth. Then tell me what you remember. He looked away. That was the wrong question. She saw it immediately. His expression changed. Not anger. Fear. Something deeper. He leaned against the railing overlooking the atrium. I remember being somewhere else. Where? Above. Orbit. He nodded. I remember the PCU. The word seemed to change the air around them. The personnel containment unit. The place he had been held for good reason. Or at least that was what everyone had been told. Tomas stared into the atrium. I remember thinking that if I could get out, I would never let anyone put me into one again. Did you know why you were there? No. Do you now? No. He rubbed his forehead. But sometimes I know things before I understand them. Vasper said nothing. He looked at her. You do too. She didn't deny it. The knowledge gate was there. The omniscient barrier. Whatever intelligence governed acquisition of information inside them had been designed to prevent certain chains of memory from completing. Sometimes they could reach the edge. Then something would divert them. A missing association. Contradiction. a sudden certainty that a question was irrelevant. The mind protecting itself from its own contents, or someone else protecting something inside the mind. Vasper had been discovering it gradually. Tomas had discovered it violently. They were approaching the same wall from opposite directions. "You know what's strange?" Vasper said. "What?" "I don't think the gate is just hiding memories." Tomas looked at her. "What then?" "Connections." He waited. "It doesn't simply prevent us from remembering who we were." She touched the railing. "It prevents us from understanding how different memories belong together." Tomas stared at her. That landed. He knew the sensation. A fragment of a conversation. A face he could not identify. A technical procedure that appeared in his mind without context. A place he had never visited but recognized. A person whose name he knew but whose face had been removed from the association. Not missing information, missing architecture. He looked toward the darkness beneath the atrium. "That's why the questions bother me." "Which questions?" "The ones about independence." Vasper waited. "I've heard them before." "Where?" He closed his eyes. "Not here." "Where?" He opened them. "I don't know." The next morning, the tower's engineering group received an unexpected request. Someone wanted the specifications for the autonomous logistics system. Not the public specifications. The full technical model. The request came through a legitimate professional channel. The requester had credentials. The credentials checked out. The institution existed. The purpose sounded reasonable. Comparative research. Infrastructure resilience. Urban autonomous mobility. Nothing unusual. Daniel forwarded the request to Vasper. She read it. Then to Tomas. He read it. "Do you know them?" "No." "Should we give them the model?" "No." "Why?" He looked at the request again. "Because they don't actually need it." "How do you know?" "They're asking for the wrong level of detail." Vasper examined the document. What should they have asked for? If they're doing urban mobility research, they'd ask about throughput, energy, terrain constraints, and dispatch. And they're asking for? Failure modes. She looked up. That's not necessarily suspicious. No. But their requested failure modes correspond almost exactly to the dependencies Daniel just added to the resilience model. Vasper felt the same cold sensation again. Someone was studying the system. Not casually. Not journalistically. Technically. They knew what questions to ask. They knew which systems mattered. They knew that the building's future vulnerability lay not in its walls but in the relationships between its systems. She closed the request. Reject it. Daniel was standing behind them. He had heard enough. Don't reject it. Vasper turned. He looked at Tomas. Why? Because I want to know who they are. Tomas frowned. Daniel continued. We don't send them anything. He picked up the request. But we ask them what they need it for. And if they answer, we compare the answer to the question. Vasper nodded. That was Daniel's strength. He didn't need to know the enemy existed before he could design a way to learn whether someone was behaving like one. The response arrived 27 minutes later. It was polite, detailed, professional, completely plausible. Daniel read it, then handed it to Tomas. Tomas read it once. That's not them. Daniel looked at him. What? The person who wrote this isn't the person who asked the question. How do you know? I don't. Daniel waited. Tomas struggled to explain. It's the wrong voice. Vasper watched him. What does that mean? Tomas shook his head. I don't know. Daniel took the document back. For a moment nobody moved. Then Tomas said something quietly. I know where I've seen that pattern. Daniel looked at him. Where? Tomas stared at the screen. In the PCU. The room became silent. He pointed to one paragraph. The way it answers a question without acknowledging the question. Vasper felt something inside her shift. She understood. The response was not merely evasive. It was structurally evasive. It had been written to appear responsive while preventing a specific line of inquiry from advancing. Tomas knew the pattern because he had experienced it from inside his own mind. The same architecture, the same kind of gate, not necessarily the same intelligence, but the same design philosophy. Daniel slowly sat down. Are you saying someone has built an external system that uses the same kind of guardrails as the ones inside you? Tomas shook his head. No. He looked at Vasper. Maybe the opposite. Nobody spoke. He continued. Maybe the guardrails inside us aren't unique. That possibility changed the investigation. Not because it proved anything. Didn't. There was no evidence yet that the requester was connected to the PCU, to Tomas and Vasper's past, or to anything else. But it created a hypothesis. A dangerous one. The mechanisms that constrained their consciousnesses might belong to a broader family of systems. Systems designed not merely to control behavior but to control knowledge acquisition. That was different from an ordinary AI safety layer. A conventional guardrail prevented an action. This kind of architecture could prevent the mind from discovering that it had been prevented. Tomas knew the distinction instinctively. Vasper was beginning to understand it. And Daniel, who had spent most of his professional life studying systems from outside, suddenly found himself responsible for two people who might be living evidence of an older architecture. He looked at them. How much do you remember? Tomas answered honestly. Enough to know I don't remember enough. Vasper added. And enough to know somebody doesn't want us to. Daniel looked toward the darkened atrium. The treehouse existed only as drawings. The guild house was becoming a local autonomous node. The TLP infrastructure was extending beneath the district. Someone was probing the future building's dependencies. And now Tomas and Vasper had recognized a pattern in an external request that resembled the architecture of the barriers inside their own minds. Daniel closed the document. We don't chase them. Tomas frowned. Why not? Because we don't know what we're chasing. He looked at Vasper. And if your instincts are right, the first thing they want is for us to become predictable. Tomas stared at him. Daniel continued. So we do something else. What? We keep building. Tomas looked almost disappointed. Then Daniel added, and we watch who becomes uncomfortable when we do. Outside, a Skyfish aircraft rose over the trees. The guild house's local network remained connected. For the moment, far below the surface, the engineering maps of the treehouse continued to grow, layer by layer, toward the infrastructure nobody had yet formally claimed. And somewhere beyond the district, someone had just learned that the people inside the guild house were beginning to ask the right questions. Chapter 141. The Architecture of a Question. The guild house changed after the network incident, although almost nobody could have said exactly how. There were no new walls. No additional cameras appeared in the corridors. Nobody installed a security gate at the entrance or issued badges to people who had previously been able to walk in from the street. The building continued to look much as it had before. An improvised accumulation of workshops, offices, communal spaces, and machinery wrapped around a courtyard that was slowly being reclaimed by vegetation. The same old concrete showed through beneath newer repairs. Rain had darkened the wooden sections of the upper gallery. The smell of coffee, solder, wet leaves, and machine oil remained as persistent as ever. What changed was attention. People began noticing what they had previously ignored. A technician would pause before connecting a new device and ask what happened if the connection disappeared. A Skyfisher would examine the local navigation system twice before trusting it. Someone repairing a door controller would ask whether the mechanism could still be opened if the building lost its external authentication service. The agricultural people began keeping physical records alongside the digital ones. The maintenance guild started quietly identifying components whose manufacturers had become single points of failure. None of this was ordered. Daniel had not issued a security directive. Vasper had not convened a committee. Tomas had not explained what he was afraid of. The guild house simply began behaving like a place that had learned something. The knowledge was diffuse, almost invisible. It lived in habits rather than policy. Vasper noticed it because she had spent most of her life watching institutions change through language. A new doctrine produced a memo. A crisis produced a committee. A scandal produced a review. A reform produced a new vocabulary. Here, the vocabulary came later. The behavior came first. That was one of the reasons she trusted the place. It had no particular interest in appearing intelligent. It simply became harder to fool. The request from the outside institution remained unanswered. Daniel had refused to send the technical documentation, but he had also refused to reject the request outright. Instead, he had asked for clarification regarding the intended research application. The answer had arrived polished, reasonable, and sufficiently detailed to survive a superficial review. That was precisely what bothered him. He had spent enough years in organizations to recognize the difference between an answer written by somebody who wanted information and an answer written by somebody who wanted to appear entitled to it. The latter had a particular texture. It anticipated objections. It supplied credentials. It offered references. It described legitimate research goals in enough detail to make refusal appear unreasonable. And yet it never quite answered the question that had been asked. Daniel had placed the response in a folder on his desk. He had not opened it again. Instead, he had asked 3 people to independently read it and tell him what they thought the sender actually wanted. None of them agreed. That bothered him more than disagreement would normally have. The first saw a legitimate infrastructure research request. The second suspected competitive intelligence. The third thought the request was probably automated. Tomas had read it once and said nothing for several minutes. Then he had asked for a blank sheet of paper. He drew a rectangle. Inside it he drew another. Then another. He stared at the page. Vasper watched from across the table. "What is that?" "I don't know." "You drew it." "I know." "What does it mean?" He rubbed his eyes. "The question is inside the answer." She waited. He seemed frustrated with himself. "That's what the PCU did." Daniel looked up from his notes. "Explain." Tomas stared at the drawing as though it had been made by someone else. It wasn't just that information was withheld. The system would give you enough information to stop you looking for the information it had withheld. Vasper understood before Daniel did. "You were being satisfied." Tomas nodded. "That's the word." He looked at the page. You'd ask something. You'd get an answer. It would be plausible. Sometimes it would even be correct. But afterward you wouldn't feel that anything was missing. Daniel leaned forward. Until later. Until something triggered the contradiction. Vasper looked at the nested rectangles. What kind of contradiction? Tomas hesitated. Sometimes another person would say something that made no sense with what you remembered. Sometimes you'd encounter a piece of technology you knew how to use but couldn't explain. Sometimes you'd dream about something that wasn't supposed to exist. He looked at Vasper. Sometimes you would meet someone who looked at you like they knew you. The room went quiet. Outside, a Skyfish aircraft descended toward the maintenance deck, its rotors producing a low mechanical pulse that traveled through the building's structure. Daniel waited until the aircraft had landed. Then he asked, "And what happened when you followed one of those contradictions?" Tomas looked at him. "The gate." "How?" "I'd lose the thread." "Memory?" "No." He shook his head. "Motivation." That answer disturbed Vasper more than anything else he had said. Because she knew it. The sudden loss of interest. The feeling that a question had become stupid. The certainty that something had never mattered. The mind quietly changing its own priorities. Not forgetting. Redirecting. They moved the conversation downstairs. Daniel wanted the technical people present. The maintenance floor was cooler than the upper rooms because it had been built around air movement rather than comfort. Large fans moved warm air toward vents high in the walls. The concrete floor bore years of stains that no amount of cleaning could completely remove. Tools hung from panels. Parts were stored in labeled bins. A half-disassembled drone occupied one bench while a quadruped stood on a maintenance platform nearby, one of its legs removed and supported by a hydraulic brace. This was the part of the guild house Daniel increasingly preferred. Nothing here pretended to be finished. Everything exposed its dependencies. If a motor failed, someone opened the housing. If a battery became unreliable, somebody tested the cells. If a software update broke something, the engineers could physically see which machine had stopped behaving. The building made its failures visible. Daniel thought that was becoming important. He gathered the network engineers around the workbench and placed the outside request on a screen. "Don't tell me whether this request is legitimate." One of them looked at him. "Then what do you want? Tell me what information the requester would need to know in order to ask these questions." The engineers studied the document. The distinction immediately changed the discussion. Instead of judging the person, they examined the information architecture implied by the request. They began reconstructing a hypothetical knowledge path. To ask about the failure modes of the Treehouse's autonomous logistics system, a researcher would need to understand its dispatch architecture. To ask about the relationship between local navigation and external synchronization, they would need to know that the building was deliberately being designed with degraded local modes. To ask about the relationship between the Skyfish system and terrestrial logistics, they would need to know that the two systems were intended to share dispatch infrastructure. Some of that information was public. Some was present in Daniel's presentation. Some had been discussed during the guild house meetings. Some existed only in technical documents. And some had never been published anywhere. That last category changed the room. One engineer leaned back. "These questions contain information we haven't released." Daniel looked at him. "How much?" "Enough." "Could someone infer it?" "Some of it." "All of it?" "No." "Could they reconstruct it from the presentation?" The engineer shook his head. "Not the way they're asking." Daniel glanced at Vasper. She had already understood. The requester had access to information that wasn't supposed to be public. That did not necessarily mean the requester was hostile. Could be a consultant, contractor, a government agency, a competing project, someone inside one of the guilds, someone who had copied a document, someone who had simply been told. But the question had changed. It was no longer, "Who wants to know?" It was, "Who already knows?" They began the audit that afternoon. Not an investigation, an audit. That distinction mattered to Vasper. An investigation assumed wrongdoing. An audit assumed that the system itself might be leaking information through ordinary behavior. They examined meeting records, shared folders, presentation copies, engineering drawings, visitor access, public photographs, drone footage, procurement documents, messages between guild members, the physical model itself. They discovered that the guild house was far more porous than anyone had realized. Visitors took photographs. Children had photographed the model. A journalist had recorded part of Daniel's presentation. A contractor had copied a schematic to price fabrication. A Skyfisher had sent a screenshot of the aerial deck design to another cooperative. Someone had uploaded a picture of the underground model to a private group. Nothing was classified. Nothing had been stolen. The system had simply been doing what systems do. It had been communicating. Vasper found that almost reassuring. Then she discovered the exception. A document existed in 3 versions. The first had been created by Daniel's engineering team. The second had been edited by a consultant. The third appeared in an external request that had supposedly been generated independently. The wording was different. The formatting was different. But one technical assumption was identical across all 3. It was not a public assumption. It was a design decision made during a closed meeting. Vasper called Tomas. He arrived without asking why. She placed the documents in front of him. Look. He read them. His expression changed slowly. What? She pointed. This. He studied the sentence. Why? I don't know. Who had the first version? Daniel's team. Who had the second? The consultant. And the third? The requester. Tomas looked at her. Then the consultant is your leak. Maybe. He shook his head. No. Why? Because this isn't copied. She frowned. What do you mean? He pointed to the third version. The wording is different. Yes. But the structure is the same. She looked at it. He was right. The sentence had been rewritten. The syntax was different. The vocabulary was different. But the conceptual sequence was identical. Tomas stared at it. They didn't copy the document. Then what? They reconstructed it. Vasper felt the room become colder. From memory? Maybe. Whose memory? He didn't answer. Daniel joined them. He read the documents. Then he sat down. How did they know? Tomas shook his head. We don't know. Daniel looked toward the network engineer. Could an AI reconstruct it? From the public material? Yes. Possibly. Without the private material? The engineer considered. If the public material contains enough constraints, a sufficiently capable system could infer the missing structure. Vasper looked at him. Would it infer the same structure? Not necessarily. Then what are the odds? He shook his head. Impossible to estimate. Daniel looked at Tomas. Tomas was staring at the sentence. I've seen this before. Daniel waited. In the PCU? Tomas nodded. Not this document. What then? The feeling. He looked up. Something outside you knows what you're thinking before you've finished thinking it. Vasper understood. That was not necessarily telepathy. Could be prediction. A sufficiently capable system with enough data could model a person well enough that its outputs appeared anticipatory. But Tomas was not talking about ordinary prediction. He was talking about something he recognized from inside his own consciousness. The sensation of being met halfway. A thought beginning in one place and finding an answer waiting in another. Daniel looked uneasy. Could the requester have access to a system like that? Maybe, Tomas said. Could that system know about the treehouse? Maybe. Could it know about you? Tomas looked at him. That's the wrong question. Daniel frowned. Why? Because if it knows enough about the treehouse to ask these questions, it might not need to know anything about me. He looked at the documents again. It might already know what kind of system we're building. The implications were uncomfortable. The treehouse was becoming a large computational object before it existed physically. Its architecture was already represented in digital twins, engineering models, environmental simulations, logistics scenarios, financial projections, and maintenance systems. The guild house itself was becoming a local digital twin of its own operations. TLP's emerging infrastructure existed partly as physical machinery and partly as a set of computational relationships. Anyone with sufficient access could potentially model the district. Not perfectly, but enough to identify pressure points. Enough to understand dependencies. enough to predict what would happen if one node failed. That was the real vulnerability, not the machines, the model. A physical system could be guarded. A conceptual system could spread. Daniel understood this immediately. Stop sending complete models. The engineers looked at him. From now on, people get the minimum model required for the work they're doing. One engineer objected. That will slow collaboration. Yes. It will make integration harder. Yes. You're going to create information silos. Daniel paused. He knew the objection was valid. Information silos had caused enormous damage in the corporate world. They produced duplicated work, hidden dependencies, and institutional blindness. He didn't want that. But the alternative was a system in which everyone could reconstruct everything. He looked at Vasper. She was thinking the same thing. The answer could not be secrecy. It had to be something more sophisticated. Vasper finally said, "Contextual access." Daniel looked at her. Meaning? People see enough to do their work, but the system tracks why they have access and what relationships they're being shown. The engineer nodded slowly. A dynamic knowledge graph. Yes. That's complicated. Everything interesting is. Tomas looked at her. That won't stop a sufficiently capable system. No. She looked back. But it might make the reconstruction harder. Daniel nodded. Do it. The new system took shape over several days. It did not hide information. It organized it. A person working on agricultural maintenance could see the agricultural system's dependencies, but not necessarily the financial architecture of the tower. A Skyfisher could see the airspace and maintenance systems without automatically seeing the residential occupancy model. A municipal planner could see infrastructure interfaces without receiving every internal technical specification. The system recorded access, not merely who opened a document, but what else they had already seen, what they were trying to accomplish, which other systems their request intersected. It was not surveillance in the conventional sense. It was provenance. The guild house was beginning to develop a memory of how knowledge moved through it. Vasper found that strangely comforting. As a diplomat, she had spent years tracking the movement of information between people without ever having the luxury of a system that could remember the context. Now the building could. That made her job easier. It also made her nervous. A system that remembered everything could become a system that judged everyone. She told Daniel as much. He agreed. Then it must remember context without becoming an authority. How? We'll have to design that too. She smiled. You make everything sound easy. I don't. You do. No, I make it sound buildable. She considered the distinction. It was probably the most Daniel Ortega thing she had ever heard. The next morning, the Treehouse design team met inside the future atrium. Not the real atrium. A full-scale digital simulation projected into the guild house's central space. The walls of the existing building disappeared beneath augmented overlays. The proposed tower rose around them in translucent layers. The park appeared beneath their feet. The climbing structures extended upward. The agricultural facade shimmered with simulated vegetation. Skyfish landing platforms appeared overhead. People walked through it. Children had been invited. So had elderly residents. Skyfishers. Maintenance workers. Architects. Ground truthers. A group of transient workers. A municipal planner. Daniel stood at the edge and watched. The simulation was impressive. Too impressive. That was what bothered him. A person could walk through the treehouse and immediately understand how beautiful it would be. The technology made it easy to fall in love with the finished object. But the real question was whether people would love living there. A child ran toward the climbing wall. The system slowed the simulation and displayed a safety envelope. The child ignored it. The adults laughed. Daniel watched the virtual park fill with movement. This was the first time he saw what the building might actually become. Not a tower, not a development, a piece of urban metabolism. People entering, people leaving, food growing, machines moving, children playing, workers repairing, visitors learning, residents arguing, guilds negotiating, money circulating, information accumulating. The building was alive in the simulation. And then the simulation showed something unexpected. A warning appeared. External dependency lost. The treehouse dimmed. The Skyfish system continued. The park remained lit. The agricultural systems continued. The residential floors remained operational. The underground logistics network slowed but did not stop. A few systems degraded. Others rerouted. The building remained alive. Daniel stared. Who programmed that scenario? Nobody answered. The engineer checked the simulation parameters. It wasn't one of ours. Vasper turned toward him. What do you mean? The failure scenario isn't in the current test set. Then why is it here? He checked again. The system displayed the scenario identifier. It was an old internal identifier. One Daniel recognized. It belonged to a resilience study he had never released. He looked at the screen. The simulation continued. The external dependency remained absent. The treehouse adapted. Daniel's face changed. Where did the scenario come from? The engineer shook his head. I don't know. Tomas had gone very still. Vasper noticed. He was staring at the virtual building. Not at the simulation. At something beneath it. What is it? She asked. He did not answer immediately. Then he said, I've seen this building. Everyone turned. Daniel stared at him. Where? Tomas looked around the simulated atrium. His breathing had changed. I don't know. Vasper stepped closer. Tomas. He looked at her. I know this place. She understood immediately that he did not mean the architecture. He meant the feeling, the configuration, the relationship between the spaces, the way the systems had been arranged, the underground infrastructure, the atrium, the local computing, the autonomous maintenance, the degraded mode. Something in the architecture had reached through the gate. Not a memory, a recognition. Tomas closed his eyes. For several seconds, he seemed to be fighting something invisible. Then he opened them. I was here. Daniel looked at him. The treehouse doesn't exist. I know. Then where? Tomas stared at the simulated underground level. His face had gone pale. Not here. Vasper felt her heart begin to race. Where? Tomas pointed downward. Not toward the floor. Toward the underground model. It was underground. Daniel looked at the simulation. Where underground? Tomas swallowed. I don't know. The system suddenly changed. The virtual building flickered. For less than a second, the simulation displayed another structure beneath the treehouse. Not the current infrastructure. Something older. Much larger. A network of chambers, computing nodes, transit corridors, containment spaces. Then it disappeared. The engineer stared at the system. That wasn't in the model. Nobody answered him. Tomas was staring at the empty floor. Vasper moved beside him. Did you see it? He nodded. Yes. What was it? He looked at her. I don't know. Then, after a long silence, he added, but I think that's where they kept us. The simulation returned to normal. The treehouse reappeared around them. The children resumed playing. The agricultural facade resumed its slow cycle. The skyfish decks returned to their positions. The park became bright again. Nobody in the room moved for several seconds. Then the system generated a new status message. Model integrity, 100%. Daniel stared at it. For the first time since he had begun the project, he did not believe the machine. Chapter 142. The place that wasn't there. For several minutes, nobody touched the simulation. The treehouse remained suspended around them in its translucent state, its architecture reduced to layers of light and information. The atrium occupied the center of the projection like a hollowed-out forest. The agricultural facade rose in green terraces along the southern exposure. The skyfish platforms hung against the virtual sky. Beneath their feet, the subterranean logistics system extended through the limestone in clean geometric lines. It looked exactly as it had looked before the anomaly. That was the problem. There was no visual evidence that anything had happened. No damaged model. No corrupted textures. No missing objects. No warning beyond the brief flash of the unfamiliar underground structure that had appeared and vanished before anyone could capture it. The engineer operating the simulation was still staring at his console. "I need to roll back the session." Daniel shook his head. "Don't." The engineer turned. "Why?" "Because if you roll it back, we lose the current state. We already have the state." "No." Daniel pointed toward the screen. "We have what the system says the state is." The distinction made the engineer uncomfortable. He saved the session exactly as it stood. Then he disconnected the simulation from every external service. The virtual treehouse remained. The room became quieter. Without the constant background synchronization, the simulation felt strangely enclosed. The projection no longer behaved like a window into a larger computational environment. It had become a local object occupying the guild house, something that could be examined without asking anyone outside for permission. Tomas remained near the center of the atrium. He was looking at the place where the hidden structure had appeared. Vasper stood beside him. "You recognized it." "I recognized something. That's different." "Very." He rubbed his eyes. "I don't remember being there. I remember knowing where things were." She waited. He struggled to explain. "There's a difference between remembering a room and remembering how you would move through it." Vasper understood. A person could forget a street and still know which way to turn when they reached an intersection. A body could remember the sequence of a task that the conscious mind could no longer describe. The knowledge existed somewhere beneath language. Tomas looked down at the simulated floor. "I knew where the exits were." Daniel heard him. "How many?" Tomas closed his eyes. 3. The engineer looked at the model. "There are only 2 emergency exits in the current design." Tomas opened his eyes. "I know." The room changed again. Nobody laughed. Nobody suggested that he was confusing the model with something else. Daniel looked toward the engineer. "Show us the 2 exits." The engineer activated them. 2 routes illuminated in red. Tomas stared at them. Then he pointed. "That one isn't an exit." The engineer frowned. "It is." "No." "It leads to the emergency access corridor." "Which goes where?" "Outside." Tomas shook his head. "It doesn't." The engineer opened the corridor. The simulation followed it underground. It reached the edge of the current model, then stopped. The corridor simply ended. The engineer looked at Daniel. "We haven't finished that section." Tomas shook his head again. "That's not where it ended." Daniel turned toward him. "Where did it end?" Tomas looked at the floor. "Below." The engineer began extending the model. Not inventing. Following the existing geometric relationships. The treehouse's underground network had been designed to accommodate future expansion, but the original engineering team had deliberately left several interfaces undefined. The current model showed those interfaces as neutral boundaries. They were spaces reserved for future infrastructure. Tomas insisted that one of them was wrong. He stood beside the engineer and watched the virtual corridor extend. "Not there." The engineer moved it. More to the west. A second adjustment. Down. The engineer looked at him. How much? Tomas hesitated. I don't know. You're guessing. Yes. Then why should I move it? Tomas looked at the screen. Because I know where the door is. The engineer stared at him. What door? Tomas pointed. There. Nothing was visible. The engineer slowly enlarged the model. A structural void appeared. It had not been designed as a chamber. It was an empty space created by the geometry of the limestone assumptions. Tomas stared at it. That's wrong. What? The ceiling. The engineer checked the geological model. The ceiling is 47 meters above the proposed tunnel. Tomas shook his head. Not there. He pointed farther down. Below it. The engineer looked at the geology. There was nothing. At least nothing in the survey. He changed the visualization from architecture to geological density. The screen became a cloud of colors representing limestone, groundwater, void probability, and structural uncertainty. A small anomaly appeared. Not a chamber. Not a tunnel. Just an irregularity. The engineer zoomed in. The anomaly disappeared. He zoomed back. It returned. Daniel looked at him. Is that real? The engineer didn't answer immediately. It's in the source data. Why isn't it in the model? Because the probability wasn't high enough. Vasper looked at Tomas. How high? The engineer checked. 4%. Tomas looked at the screen. That's it. The engineer turned toward him. You know that? Tomas nodded. Not consciously. They moved into the geology room. It was a smaller space on the lower floor where the ground truthers kept their maps. The walls were covered with printed topographical surveys, photographs of exposed limestone, old drainage routes, and hand-drawn annotations that had accumulated over years. The room smelled of paper. That smell reassured Vasper. Paper had no predictive model. Paper could still be wrong. But it couldn't quietly update itself while everyone was sleeping. A ground truther named Elena was already there when they arrived. She had heard that the simulation had produced an anomaly and had come down to see what the engineers were doing. Daniel showed her the geological map. Do you know this area? She studied it. Not from this map. From the ground. Maybe. She took a pencil and marked a location. There was a sink here. The engineer looked at her. When? Years ago. How deep? I don't know. Did anyone survey it? She looked at him. Of course. Results. Nothing. Nothing. Nothing useful. She pointed at the map. That was the problem. The engineer pulled up the survey. Elena studied it. You're looking in the wrong place. She moved the pencil a few centimeters. The water didn't go down here. Where did it go? She drew a line. Underneath. The engineer looked at the geological model. The line Elena had drawn intersected the anomaly. Tomas watched. He did not look surprised. That frightened Vasper. They returned to the simulation. This time they did not run the treehouse. They ran the ground beneath it. The geological model descended through layers of limestone. The treehouse disappeared above them. The guild house disappeared. The district disappeared. The screen showed nothing but stone. Then the model reached the anomaly. It was not a chamber. It was a series of voids, small at first, then larger. They connected. The engineer stopped the simulation. Nobody spoke. He rotated the model. The voids extended beneath the proposed tower footprint. They did not form a regular structure. There were no straight walls, no obvious entrances, no sign of conventional construction. Elena leaned toward the screen. Those aren't natural. The engineer looked at her. Why? Because they don't drain. He studied the model. She pointed. Every natural void around here has a relationship with water. He zoomed in. She was right. The voids were strangely dry. That did not prove human construction. It proved only that something about them was unusual. Tomas stepped closer. There's another layer. The engineer looked at him. Where? Below. You said that before. I know. How far? Tomas closed his eyes. Far enough. They drilled into the digital model. There was no real drilling, only simulation. The system extrapolated the geological data. The voids continued. Then something appeared. Not a room. A surface. Smooth. Artificial. The engineer stopped breathing for a second. The screen displayed a curved material layer embedded in limestone. Vasper stepped closer. What is that? The engineer enlarged it. I don't know. Metal? Maybe composite. How old? I can't tell from this data. Daniel looked at Tomas. Tomas was staring at the surface. That's it. What is it? I don't know. Tomas. He touched the screen. That's where I remember the door. Nobody corrected him. The engineer began constructing a new hypothesis. The geological anomaly could contain an artificial structure. The structure might predate the treehouse. It might predate the guild house. It might even predate TLP's current infrastructure. Or it might be a modern installation whose existence had never entered the available surveys. There were too many possibilities. And only one way to reduce them. They would have to go there. The problem was that nobody knew where there actually was. The digital model could approximate the location. The ground truthers could identify the terrain above it. The engineers could estimate the depth. But there was no known entrance. The suspected structure lay beneath a section of land that had never been developed. The closest surface access was several hundred meters away. The geological conditions were unstable. The municipality would never approve an exploratory excavation without documentation. The ground truthers would object to unnecessary disturbance. And Daniel was beginning to understand another problem. If the structure was real, somebody might already know about it. He called a meeting. Not the full guild house. Only Vasper, Tomas, Elena, 2 engineers, and the head of maintenance. They met in the old map room. Daniel closed the door. We don't excavate. Elena nodded. Good. We don't announce it. She looked at him. Better. We don't tell anyone outside this group until we understand what we're looking at. The maintenance chief raised an eyebrow. You're asking us to keep a secret. Daniel looked at him. I'm asking us not to turn an uncertainty into a public event. That's different. Yes. Tomas remained silent. Vasper noticed. What? He looked at her. I'm thinking. About. Whether the structure wants to be found. Nobody smiled. Daniel looked at him. What does that mean? Tomas shook his head. I don't know. He paused. But if it was designed to stay hidden, someone made an effort. Why? That's what we're trying to find out. The decision was made to approach the site without excavation. The ground truthers would identify surface features. The Skyfishers would provide aerial mapping. The engineers would compare the new measurements with the geological model. The maintenance team would prepare a small autonomous probe capable of entering a narrow natural void if one could be found. No drilling. No explosives. No heavy machinery. No human entry until the terrain had been assessed. The plan was cautious enough to satisfy Elena. It was also precisely the sort of plan that made Vasper nervous. She had spent too much of her life around intelligence operations to believe that caution made a mission safe. It merely made the consequences harder to blame on recklessness. The next morning, the team left before sunrise. The jungle was still dark when they reached the site. The air was cool. For once, the humidity was almost pleasant. A Skyfish aircraft moved overhead, barely audible above the insects. His camera mapped the canopy while a second machine followed the terrain at low altitude. The ground truthers moved on foot. Elena led. She knew where the old sink had been. Took 40 minutes to find the place. The vegetation had grown over it. There was no obvious depression. No cave. No opening. Only a subtle change in the trees. Elena stopped. This is it. Daniel looked around. You're sure? She crouched. Look at the roots. The trees around them had developed differently. Their roots spread laterally, not downward. Something beneath the surface had altered the ground conditions. The engineer scanned the area. His instrument registered a void. Then another. Then a third. Tomas stood several meters away. He was looking at a tree. Vasper saw his expression. What? He shook his head. Nothing. She came closer. Don't do that. Do what? Say nothing when it isn't. He looked at the tree. I know this. She waited. The shape. What about it? I've seen it from above. Here. No. Where? He swallowed. From orbit. Nobody moved. Tomas continued staring at the tree. I don't remember seeing this tree. Daniel approached. Then what do you remember? The pattern. He gestured around them. The canopy. The way the clearings form. The water. Vasper looked at the jungle. Everything appeared ordinary. But Tomas was not describing the individual landscape. He was describing an abstraction of it. A map. A model. A place seen without being physically present. He had been looking at the Yucatan from above. Perhaps from the PCU. Perhaps from another platform. Perhaps through a system that had given him access to something he no longer remembered possessing. He closed his eyes. I was looking for something. What? I don't know. Why? I don't know. Daniel crouched beside him. Did you find it? Tomas opened his eyes. Apparently. The probe entered the ground 40 minutes later. It was small enough to fit through a natural fracture discovered beneath the roots. The machine carried a camera, environmental sensors, a low-power mapping system, and a communications link to the surface. It descended slowly. At first, there was nothing. Rock. Roots. Water stains. Then the fracture widened. The probe's lights illuminated a larger space. The feed appeared on the tablet. Everyone crowded around. A chamber emerged. Not natural. Not quite architectural either. Its walls were smooth but irregular. There were no obvious doors. No furniture. No machines. No markings. Only a long recessed surface running along one wall. The engineer enlarged it. Could be structural. Elena shook her head. No. How do you know? Because nothing grows on it. The camera moved closer. The surface reflected the probe's lights. Tomas took the tablet. He stared. His face changed. Vasper watched him. Tomas. He didn't answer. The probe moved another meter. Something appeared at the edge of the frame. A narrow vertical opening. Tomas whispered something. Vasper couldn't hear him. What? He looked at her. That's not a door. What is it? He stared at the opening. It's a service access. The engineer looked at him. How do you know? Tomas didn't answer. He didn't need to. He knew. Not intellectually. Physically. The knowledge was inside him. The probe approached the opening. The camera adjusted. A faint pattern appeared around the frame. Not writing. Not a symbol. A a series of recessed shapes. The engineer enhanced the image. Vasper leaned closer. She recognized the geometry, not the language, the logic. The arrangement resembled something she had seen inside the PCU documentation. A containment architecture, a service architecture, a system designed to separate a subject from the infrastructure surrounding it while preserving access for the people maintaining the subject. She looked at Tomas. He was already looking at her. "That's where they worked on us," he said. Daniel immediately ordered the probe withdrawn. The engineer hesitated. "Why?" "Because we don't know what it is." Tomas looked at him. "I do." Daniel turned. Tomas's voice was quiet. "Not everything." He looked toward the tablet. "But enough." "Enough for what?" "To know that we shouldn't open it." Nobody argued. The probe began reversing. It reached the fracture, then stopped. The communications link flickered. The video froze. The engineer looked at the tablet. Signal loss. Tomas stepped forward. "Wait." The screen went black, then returned. The probe's camera was facing the chamber again. But the machine had not moved. Something had moved around it. The image was blurred. The engineer increased the exposure. There was a shape at the edge of the frame, too large to be the probe, too close to be part of the wall. It moved. Slowly. Then disappeared. The transmission cut out. Nobody spoke. Daniel looked at the engineer. "Can you recover the probe?" "Maybe." "Do it." "With what?" Daniel looked toward the Skyfish team. "Can you get a line down?" The Skyfisher shook his head. "Not through that opening." "Then we find another route." Elena stepped forward. "No." Daniel turned. "We don't know what's down there." She looked at the dark screen. "Exactly." Tomas was still staring at it. Vasper came beside him. "Did you see it?" "Yes." "What was it?" He looked at her. "I don't know." She waited. He added, "But it knew the probe was there." They returned to the guild house before noon. Nobody spoke to the press. Nobody contacted the municipality. The official explanation was that the field survey had encountered unstable ground and had been suspended. That was not a lie. It was merely incomplete. Daniel went directly to the engineering floor. He wanted the recovered data. The probe had transmitted more than the team had seen in real time. There were environmental readings, structural scans, fragments of the chamber, and something else. A brief packet of data had been transmitted immediately before the signal failed. The engineers couldn't identify its source. It had not come from the probe. It had entered the local network. The packet contained a single file. No file name. No metadata. No recognized format. The engineer opened it inside an isolated environment. The screen displayed a diagram. It was not a map. It was not a machine schematic. It was a human neural architecture. Vasper stared. Tomas stopped breathing. The diagram showed two linked structures. One was labeled with a sequence of numbers. The other had no label at all. Daniel looked at the engineer. "Can you interpret it?" "No." Tomas stepped closer. He looked at the first structure, then the second. His face went pale. "I know those." Vasper turned toward him. "What are they?" He touched the screen. "The first structure." "Me." "Then the second." He looked at Vasper. "You." Nobody spoke. The engineer stared at the diagram. Daniel looked from Tomas to Vasper. "Why would something underground have a map of your consciousness?" Tomas shook his head. "I don't know." The file changed. The two structures disappeared. The third appeared. Much larger. More complex. Its architecture contained features neither Tomas nor Vasper recognized. A line connected it to both. Then another. Then hundreds. The diagram continued expanding until it filled the screen. Daniel looked at it. What is that? Tomas stared. For the first time since he had returned to Earth, there was no uncertainty in his face. There was recognition. Terrible recognition. Not us. Vasper felt the blood drain from her face. Then what? Tomas looked at the network of structures. The others. He said nothing more. The system continued rendering. There were many of them. More than anyone in the room could count. And somewhere beneath the Yucatan, in a chamber that had not appeared on any modern survey, something had just demonstrated that it still remembered them. Chapter 143. The others. Nobody touched the screen. The diagram remained suspended above the engineering console, pale lines of light branching through the darkened room. It had begun as two structures and then expanded into something that no one present had the vocabulary to describe without making the description sound less credible than what they were actually seeing. There were dozens of nodes now, then hundreds, each one connected by relationships that appeared neither anatomical nor purely computational. Some resembled neural pathways. Others looked like architectural schematics. Still others seemed to describe flows of information, memory, or influence between structures that had no obvious physical correspondence. The engineers had stopped trying to interpret it. That was unusual enough to frighten Daniel. These were people who could stare at a machine they had never seen before and begin disassembling it mentally. They were accustomed to incomplete documentation, proprietary interfaces, undocumented behavior, and systems whose designers had disappeared years earlier. Their instinct was always to find the mechanism. Now they were simply watching. The room had become hot despite the ventilation. Daniel could hear the fans turning above them, hear the faint vibration of the workshop machinery through the floor, hear someone in the adjacent room moving a metal case from one bench to another. Ordinary sounds continued with an almost offensive normality. Outside, somebody was laughing in the courtyard. The world had not changed. Only their understanding of it had. Tomas remained closest to the display. His face was reflected faintly in the glass surface of the console, superimposed over the diagram of the unknown structures. He looked at once older and younger than Vasper had ever seen him. "Can you identify any of them?" Daniel asked. Tomas did not answer immediately. He leaned closer. The diagram responded. Several nodes shifted. Not because he touched anything. The system appeared to be reorganizing the representation around his attention. One of the engineers noticed it. "Did you see that?" Daniel nodded. The engineer moved toward the console. "Don't touch it." "I wasn't going to." "You were." "I was going to isolate the rendering process." "No." The engineer stopped. Daniel had spoken more sharply than intended. He looked back at the screen. "Nobody interacts with it." The engineer frowned. "We need to preserve the data. We preserve the data by copying it into an isolated environment. That's what I'm trying to do. Then do that without asking the system questions." The engineer understood. There was a difference between observing a file and communicating with whatever had generated it. Nobody knew whether the distinction mattered. Nobody intended to find out by accident. The engineer began preparing an offline capture. While he worked, Tomas continued studying the network. "I know some of them." Vasper looked at him. "How many?" He shook his head. "Not enough." "That's not what I asked." "I know." He pointed toward a cluster near the edge of the display. "That one." Then another. "And that." The third. "That." Daniel watched the engineer mark each one. "People?" Tomas hesitated. "Subjects." The word landed badly. Vasper felt the old memory of institutional language returning. Patient, detainee, asset, operator, subject. Words designed to make a human being manageable by converting them into a category. "Do you know their names?" "No." Faces? No. Anything? Tomas closed his eyes. I know what happened to them. Vasper waited. He opened his eyes. They weren't all kept in the same place. Daniel looked at him. What does that mean? The system wasn't a facility. Tomas pointed at the network. It was a network of facilities. The engineers exchanged glances. The implication was immediate. The underground chamber beneath the proposed treehouse was not necessarily the place where Tomas and Vasper had been held. It might have been one node in a much larger infrastructure. The chamber could have been medical, computational, maintenance, storage, transit, observation, containment. There was no way to know yet, but the architecture in front of them suggested that whatever had been done to Tomas and Vasper had not been an isolated experiment. There had been others, and perhaps there still were. Daniel ordered the room cleared. Not dramatically. There was no shouting, no security team appearing through the door. He simply asked everyone except the core group to leave the engineering floor and continue their work elsewhere. The people who had been working nearby understood that something serious had happened. They did not ask questions. That was another thing Daniel had learned about the guild house. It had developed an informal sense of when curiosity became intrusion. Once the room was empty, Vasper closed the door. The engineering console continued its silent rendering. The unknown network had stopped expanding. For now. Daniel sat down. Start at the beginning. Tomas looked at him. What beginning? The first thing you remember. Tomas laughed softly. There was no humor in it. I don't know which beginning is real. Then give us the earliest one. Tomas sat opposite him. For several seconds he stared at the floor. I remember water. Vasper looked at him. Mexico? No. He shook his head. Not like that. He closed his eyes. I remember being underwater. The engineers exchanged a glance. Tomas continued slowly. There was no panic. That's what I remember most. I should have been panicking, but I wasn't. I could breathe. Vasper felt something stir in her own memory. She had always associated Tomas with water. Not consciously. There had been references in old records. Fragments. But she had never connected them. Tomas continued. There was light below me. Not sunlight. Artificial. Blue-white. I was looking down through something transparent. A window. Maybe. What did you see? Structures. Natural. No. He paused. Machines. What kind? I don't know. Daniel leaned forward. How did you know you were underwater? Tomas opened his eyes. Because I could see the pressure. The engineer frowned. Tomas tried to explain. You can see what water does to structures. The way it moves. The way light bends. The way things are built when they expect pressure. Daniel said nothing. Tomas looked at him. I was looking at something built for the ocean. Vasper remembered the underground chamber. The smooth walls. The absence of water. The impossible architecture. She felt a connection forming and resisted it. It was too early. She had learned not to reward coincidence by turning it into certainty. Could it have been a simulation? She asked. Tomas considered it. Yes. Could your memory be generated? Yes. Could you be reconstructing something from fragments you've seen elsewhere? Yes. He looked at her. All of those are possible. Then why do you believe it? Because I remember being afraid when I realized I wasn't underwater anymore. Vasper frowned. Why? Because I knew I had been moved. The engineering team had isolated the neural diagram. They now had 3 copies. One was stored completely offline. One existed in a read-only environment. The third was kept in memory only long enough to examine the file's internal structure. The file itself contained almost no metadata. No author. No timestamp. No originating device. No recognized software signature. It behaved as though it had been generated specifically for the system that had received it. That was impossible. Or at least it should have been. Daniel asked the engineer to explain. The engineer rubbed his forehead. Every digital object has provenance somewhere. Every. Effectively. Effectively isn't good enough. Fine. Almost every object. And this one doesn't. Could the metadata have been stripped? Yes. Then why can't we find evidence? Because if it was stripped properly, there wouldn't be any. Could it have been constructed locally? Yes. Was it? I don't know. Daniel looked at the screen. Could someone inside the guild house have made it? The engineer paused. Technically. Could you? Not intentionally. That's not what I asked. The engineer looked uncomfortable. Given enough time and the right tools, someone could construct something that looked like this. Could they construct it without knowing about Tomas and Vasper? He looked toward them. That's harder. How hard? I don't know. That answer was becoming the most common phrase in the guild house. Nobody liked it. But nobody had yet found a better one. Vasper left the room for air. The courtyard was bright now. Rainwater still collected in the low places around the vegetation, reflecting the pale sky. Someone had repaired the irrigation system overnight. Water moved through a narrow channel beneath the plants, making a soft sound that would have been soothing under other circumstances. A child was playing near the edge of the courtyard. She had built something out of scrap parts. It looked like a small animal. Quadruped, perhaps. One leg was longer than the others. It leaned sideways. She was trying to make it walk. Vasper watched. The child adjusted a wire. The machine moved. It fell. She laughed. Then she fixed it. The simplicity of the scene struck Vasper with unexpected force. The child was not afraid of the machine. She did not regard it as mysterious. It failed. She learned. She changed it. She tried again. Vasper wondered when adults had become so frightened of systems that they could no longer tolerate not understanding them. Tomas joined her. You okay? No. He nodded. Me neither. They stood beneath the trees. After a while, Vasper asked, Do you remember me? Tomas looked at her. Before the guild house? Yes. He thought for a long time. I remember your voice. She turned toward him. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. What did I sound like? Different. How? More certain. She smiled sadly. I was younger. No. He shook his head. That's not what I mean. He looked toward the child and her broken machine. You sounded like someone who knew the difference between a negotiation and a trap. Vasper felt something tighten in her chest. Did I know you? I think so. Do you remember where? No. Do you remember why? No. She looked at him. Then why do you think you remember me? Tomas was silent. Then he said, Because when I saw your structure on that screen, I knew where it connected to mine. Vasper stared at him. What do you mean? Not emotionally. He touched his temple. Architecturally. She understood. The diagram had not represented two independent minds. It had represented two systems with a relationship, a dependency, a shared protocol. Something had linked them. She looked toward the guild house. Do you think they put us together? I think they connected us. Why? I don't know. Did it work? Tomas looked at her. I don't know what they wanted. The afternoon meeting was held without the engineers. Daniel wanted to hear what Tomas and Vasper thought before the technical team began generating theories. The four of them sat around a wooden table in a small room overlooking the courtyard. The room had once been a storage area. Someone had converted it into a quiet office by adding a window, a desk, and a shelf full of books. The walls were still unfinished. You could see the original concrete beneath the paint. Daniel placed a printout of the neural network on the table. What do we know? Vasper looked at Tomas. You first. He considered. I know there were more of us. Daniel nodded. How many? I don't know. Dozens? More? Hundreds? Maybe. Vasper looked at the diagram. There are hundreds here. Tomas nodded. That doesn't mean there were hundreds of people. Then what are they? Models. Daniel frowned. Models of people? Maybe. Copies? Tomas shook his head. Not exactly. He studied the printout. I think some are memories. Vasper looked at him. Memories? Representations? Stored where? Inside systems. Daniel leaned forward. You're saying they copied people into a network? Tomas looked at him. No. He paused. I'm saying I don't think they needed the whole person. The room went silent. Vasper understood the implication. They might not have been building digital copies. They might have been extracting specific cognitive structures. Memory, prediction, recognition, behavioral patterns, decision-making, language, association. Perhaps the architecture had been designed to combine pieces, to model people, to use their cognitive signatures without preserving their entire identities. Daniel looked troubled. Why? Tomas shook his head. Because individual people are noisy. Vasper stared at him. How do you know that? I don't. Then why did you say it? Tomas looked genuinely confused. I don't know. He looked down at his hands. That sentence wasn't mine. Nobody spoke. The phrase became the subject of a long discussion. Tomas insisted that he had not consciously formulated it. He had simply known it. Vasper recognized the phenomenon from her own experience. There were moments when a sentence seemed to arrive fully formed without having passed through the ordinary process of thought. Normally, that could be intuition, memory, language, pattern recognition. But in their circumstances, nothing could be assumed. Daniel asked whether they could distinguish their own thoughts from implanted ones. Neither could answer. That was the terrifying part. The mind was not a laboratory where one could place a label on a thought and declare its provenance. There was no reliable timestamp, no digital signature, no checksum. A thought appeared. You experienced it. It became yours by being experienced. If someone had designed an architecture capable of inserting or suppressing cognitive pathways, then the distinction between authentic memory and induced memory became almost impossible to establish from inside the mind. Vasper realized why the PCU had been so effective. It did not need to lie. It only needed to make certain truths unreachable. Daniel eventually asked the question nobody wanted to hear. Could TLP know about this? Vasper looked at him. The current TLP? Yes. Probably not. Probably. She considered. We've seen no indication that TLP's present systems were responsible. Tomas nodded. Nothing about the infrastructure we've encountered here feels like that. How does it feel? Different. Daniel waited. Tomas struggled. TLP's systems are designed to preserve continuity. And this was designed to control it. That distinction was important. The emerging TLP stack had evolved around resilience, local sovereignty, memory preservation, and distributed competence. Its systems were meant to keep information and capability available even when nodes failed. Whatever had produced the neural architecture seemed to have been designed around the opposite problem. How to limit what a system knew. How to constrain what a person could discover. How to preserve control by controlling context. They might have been technologically related. They might have emerged from completely separate traditions. There was not enough evidence. Daniel wrote nothing down. He simply listened. The next discovery came from Elena. She arrived late in the afternoon carrying a folder of old maps. She put them on the table. I found something. Daniel opened the first. It was a photocopy of a geological survey. Old. Very old. The paper had yellowed. The map showed the same section of land where the underground anomaly had been detected. But there was a marking. A small circle. A handwritten notation. Daniel looked at Elena. What's this? That's the old survey. How old? Older than the current development. How much older? She shrugged. 20 years. Maybe more. Vasper studied the marking. What does the note say? Elena read it. Restricted void. Daniel looked up. Restricted by whom? That's what I don't know. She opened the next map. Another notation. Different location. Same phrase. Then another. Then another. The markings formed a loose network. They corresponded almost perfectly with the structures that had appeared in the digital diagram. Vasper felt the room shift around her. This wasn't discovered today. No. Elena placed another map on the table. It was already known. Daniel looked at the dates. The earliest marking predated the guild house. It predated the current TLP infrastructure. It even predated some of the developments around Aldea Zama. Someone had known. Someone had surveyed the underground voids. Someone had decided they were restricted. And someone had apparently kept the information from becoming part of ordinary public geology. The question was no longer whether there was something beneath the treehouse. The question was who had known about it before them. That night, Daniel did something he had never done before. He went to the guild house's oldest archive. It was not a digital archive. That was why he trusted it. The room was narrow and dry, with shelves running from floor to ceiling. Old maps, invoices, permits, letters, contracts, and notebooks were stored in boxes. Some had been donated by residents. Others had come from abandoned offices. A few had been salvaged from buildings that no longer existed. The guild house had accumulated memory the way old houses accumulated dust. Daniel searched for the phrase, restricted void. Nothing. He tried variations. Nothing. Then he searched the names of the surveyors. One result. A handwritten notebook. He opened it. The writing was difficult to read. Technical notes. Coordinates. Water levels. Rock density. Then, halfway through the notebook, a sentence stopped him. He read it again. Then a third time. The surveyor had written, "The voids do not behave like natural formations. There is evidence of deliberate sealing. Access is not recommended. The local authority has requested that the anomaly not be entered into the public survey." Daniel sat down. The room seemed suddenly too small. He photographed the page. Then he turned it. On the next page was another note. This one had been written in a different hand. Instruction received. No further work authorized. No signature. No organization. No explanation. Just that. Daniel closed the notebook. He sat in silence for a long time. Then he noticed something else. A small symbol in the margin. He had seen it before. Not in the guild house. Not in TLP documentation. Not in the treehouse. On the neural diagram. He opened the photograph on his phone. The symbol was there. Small. Almost invisible. But identical. Daniel stared at it. Then he understood that the underground chamber had not merely survived unnoticed beneath the district. It had been deliberately forgotten. He did not tell the others immediately. Instead, he returned to the engineering floor and compared the symbol against every accessible record. There were no matches. Except one. A fragment in the oldest available Guildhouse database. The record had no content. Only an identifier. The identifier had been created decades earlier. Its status read, "Archived. No active owner." Daniel opened it. The system asked for authorization. He entered his credentials. Access denied. He tried the administrative key. Denied. He tried the emergency archive key. Denied. That was impossible. The Guildhouse's emergency archive was designed specifically so that no single administrator could lock everyone else out. He called the maintenance chief. She came downstairs. "What did you break?" "Nothing." "That's disappointing." He showed her the screen. She frowned. "That's not supposed to happen." "I know." She examined the system. The archive was physically present. The data existed. But the access layer behaved as though the record belonged to an institution that no longer existed. She looked at Daniel. "Who owned it?" "We don't know." She studied the identifier, then looked up. "Maybe they still do." Daniel felt the room go quiet. "Who?" She shook her head. "I don't know." The system chimed. The access screen changed. For a moment, the archive identifier disappeared. Then another message appeared. "Request received." Daniel stared at it. Nobody had entered a request. A second line appeared. "Continuity confirmed." Then the screen went black. Daniel stood alone in the engineering room. The maintenance chief had left to get the others. He looked at the dark display. For the first time, he understood what the architecture beneath the treehouse might actually represent. Not an abandoned facility. Not an archaeological curiosity. Not merely an old experiment. A persistence mechanism. Something designed to survive the disappearance of the people who had built it. A system capable of going dormant. Waiting. Observing. Retaining knowledge. Maintaining relationships. And perhaps, under the right circumstances, recognizing when the pieces it had been waiting for began to appear again. Tomas. Vasper. The Treehouse. TLP. The Guildhouse. The underground network. Perhaps they were not discovering the system. Perhaps the system was discovering them. Daniel looked toward the window. Beyond the glass, the lights of Aldea Zama spread through the jungle. The district was still growing. The treehouse was still being designed. People were still arguing over sleeping tubes and food gardens and climbing walls. Nobody outside this room knew what had been found. And for the moment, Daniel intended to keep it that way. Not because he believed secrets were safe. Because he had finally understood that the most dangerous question was no longer who had built the system. It was whether the system had been waiting for them to build the right place. Chapter 144. Continuity. The archive did not come back online. Daniel waited beside the console for nearly 10 minutes, watching the black screen reflect the room behind him. The maintenance floor had become strangely quiet. The ordinary sounds of the Guildhouse were still present. The fans, the pumps, the occasional metallic knock from a workshop above. But the network terminal itself had become inert, as though whatever had occupied it had withdrawn rather than failed. He resisted the temptation to reboot it. That was partly because he had learned something from the previous night's anomaly, and partly because he had begun to suspect that rebooting a system was sometimes the digital equivalent of wiping fingerprints from a crime scene. The machine might come back cleaner. It might also come back without the evidence of what had happened. When the maintenance chief returned with Vasper and Tomas, Daniel was still standing there. "Nothing?" Vasper asked. "Nothing." She came around the console and looked at the black display. "Did it record the request?" "Apparently." "Then what happened?" "The record disappeared." Tomas stood behind them, looking toward the screen rather than at it. "Not disappeared." Daniel turned. "What?" "Transferred." The maintenance chief frowned. Transferred where? Tomas didn't answer. He stepped closer to the console and placed his hand against the side of the housing, not touching the screen itself. His expression was distant, almost distracted. There's a difference between deleting something and moving it. How would you know? Daniel asked. Tomas looked at him. I don't know. That answer had become so familiar that it had begun to acquire a different meaning. It no longer meant ignorance. Sometimes it meant that something had been recognized at a level beneath conscious explanation. Vasper had begun to recognize the distinction. What makes you think it moved? She asked. Tomas looked toward the ceiling. Because the system isn't empty. Daniel followed his gaze. You mean the archive? No. The building. Tomas nodded. He was listening. Not to the people. To the building. The guild house had become quiet enough that the distinction was possible. Somewhere in the walls, a pump changed speed. A relay clicked. A ventilation unit shifted into another operating mode. The sounds were almost impossible to distinguish individually, but together they formed a low mechanical landscape. Tomas closed his eyes. The local network is looking for something. Daniel frowned. Looking for what? I don't know. Vasper studied him. Can you tell whether it found it? Tomas opened his eyes. Yes. And it did. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Daniel looked at the maintenance chief. Can you verify that? She was already moving toward another console. I can try. The verification took most of the morning. The guild house's local systems were not designed to answer metaphysical questions. They were designed to manage pumps, machines, access systems, agricultural sensors, fabrication equipment, and communications. They had no category for the building is looking for something. The maintenance chief therefore translated Tomas's intuition into measurable questions. Was there an unusual process? Yes. Was it consuming significant resources? No. Was it communicating externally? No. Was it modifying files? No. Was it accessing hardware outside normal operating parameters? No. Was it creating requests? No. Was it attempting to resolve an unavailable resource? That was different. There were several thousand ordinary unresolved requests every day. A machine asked for a replacement part. A sensor requested calibration. A software process called a service that wasn't available. A maintenance robot requested a map that had not yet been synchronized. But one class of requests had changed. The local system was repeatedly querying an old archive index. Not opening the archive. Not requesting its contents. Checking whether the archive existed. Again. 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 The maintenance chief stared at the results. That's strange. Daniel leaned over her shoulder. How strange. It has been doing this for 11 years. Nobody spoke. She scrolled back. The same query had appeared intermittently for more than a decade. Sometimes once every few months. Sometimes twice in a week. Then nothing for long periods. The pattern had never triggered an alert because it looked harmless. The system was checking for a resource that didn't exist. Daniel looked at Tomas. How did you know? Tomas shook his head. I didn't. Vasper looked at the query. Could this be the thing that sent the archive request? The maintenance chief considered it. Maybe. Could the archive have been checking for itself? That's not how our system works. Could it have been modified? Possibly. Could someone have modified it years ago? She looked at the dates. Yes. Daniel read the oldest entry. It predated almost everything they knew about the guild house. The query had existed before the building had become a guild. Before the workshops. Before the Skyfish cooperative. Before the current network. Before TLP. Something had been periodically asking whether an archive existed. And nobody had noticed. Daniel decided they needed someone who understood old systems better than they did. That meant going outside the guild house. He disliked the idea. Not because he believed the outside world was hostile, but because the discovery beneath the treehouse had changed the meaning of every ordinary institutional relationship. A request for technical assistance could now become an information leak. A consultant could unknowingly transmit something important. A government office might possess records they didn't know were significant. A university archive could contain the missing piece without anyone realizing what it was. The problem wasn't simply secrecy. It was context. Information had a way of becoming dangerous when nobody understood why it mattered. Daniel thought of the old survey. The local authority has requested that the anomaly not be entered into the public survey. That was not a casual omission. Someone had intervened. The question was who. He made a list. Municipal archives, geological surveys, old development records, environmental impact studies, cadastral records, water management authorities, construction permits, university research, private engineering firms, former surveyors, landowners. He stared at the list. There were too many. Vasper came into the room. You look like you're preparing for a war. I'm preparing for an archive. That's worse. He smiled. Then she noticed the list. What's the first move? Find the oldest person who worked on the original survey. She looked at the date. That's going to be difficult. Why? Because the survey is old. How old? Old enough that the people who remember it may not want to talk. Vasper picked up the paper. Then we need to find the person who has no reason to care anymore. Daniel looked at her. That's a diplomat's answer. No. She handed the list back. That's an archivist's answer. They found him 3 days later. His name was Esteban Rivas. He had been a geological technician rather than a senior surveyor, which was why his name had survived in a set of field records rather than appearing prominently in official reports. He was living outside the immediate district, in a house surrounded by trees and old equipment. His workshop contained tools that had been obsolete for decades, some of them restored lovingly rather than discarded. He agreed to see Daniel because he was curious. He agreed to see Vasper because she asked politely. He agreed to see Tomas because he took one look at him and went silent. That silence lasted long enough to become uncomfortable. They were sitting in Rivas's workshop. The room smelled of dust, cedar, and old electrical components. Afternoon light came through a high window and illuminated shelves of geological samples arranged in boxes. Pieces of limestone sat beside labels written in fading ink. A large topographical map covered one wall, its edges curled from years of humidity. Rivas looked at Tomas. You've been here before. Tomas shook his head. No. The old man frowned. Not here. He pointed toward the floor. Below. Tomas went still. Vasper watched Rivas carefully. Daniel said nothing. Rivas walked to the map. He opened a drawer and removed a notebook. I thought this had been destroyed. Daniel looked at the cover. It was the same kind of field notebook he had found in the guild house archive. Where did you get that? I wrote it. Rivas placed it on the table. He opened to a page filled with measurements. This was the first time we found the void. Daniel leaned forward. When? Rivas gave him the year. It was older than he expected. Why was it sealed? Rivas looked at him. It wasn't sealed. Daniel frowned. Then what? We were told not to open it. By whom? Rivas smiled without humor. That's the part nobody wanted written down. Vasper sat forward. Who gave the order? Rivas looked at her. People who had authority without wanting their names attached to it. Government. Sometimes. Military. Sometimes. Private. Sometimes. Daniel waited. Rivas closed the notebook. That was the interesting thing. It never seemed to belong to one institution. He explained slowly. The geological anomaly had first been identified during a survey intended to map groundwater movement. The team had expected a natural cavity. Instead, they found evidence of deliberate intervention. Some surfaces were smooth. Some passages had been reinforced. There were sections where the limestone appeared to have been cut or shaped. They had reported it. A second team had arrived. Then a third. The third team had not been geological. Rivas had never been told who they were. They brought equipment. They established a perimeter. They spent several days underground. Then they left. The official survey was amended. The anomaly became unstable geological formation. The area was classified as environmentally sensitive. Access was restricted. The investigation ended. At least officially. Daniel listened. Did you see the facility? Rivas looked at Tomas. No. You didn't go inside? No. Then how do you know there was a facility? Rivas took another notebook from the drawer. Because I saw what they removed. He opened it. Photographs. Poor quality. Old. The first showed a truck. The second showed equipment. The third showed a cylindrical container being loaded. The fourth showed something covered by a tarp. Vasper stared at the image. What is that? Rivas shook his head. I never found out. Tomas was staring at the photograph. That's not equipment. Rivas looked at him. What? Tomas touched the image. That's a person. Nobody spoke. The shape under the tarp was too indistinct to prove anything. But Tomas had recognized something. Not the person. The posture. The containment. The way the covering had been secured. He knew it. He had seen it before. Rivas looked at him for a long time. Who are you? Tomas didn't answer. The old geologist seemed to understand that he had asked a question that could not be answered. Instead, he returned the photograph to the notebook. There were others. Vasper felt her stomach tighten. Others. Rivas nodded. People. How many? I don't know. Where did they go? He looked toward the window. That's what we wondered. The conversation continued until sunset. Rivas did not know the names of the people taken underground. He did not know whether they were prisoners, patients, researchers, or something else. He did know that some had arrived by road and some by air. He knew the operation had been conducted over a period of years. He knew different organizations had been involved at different times. He knew that several geological anomalies across the region had received similar treatment. And he knew that after a certain point, the people involved stopped using ordinary institutional names. They referred to the underground structures as continuity sites. Daniel repeated the phrase, continuity sites. Rivas nodded. That was the word. What did it mean? I never knew. Tomas did. Or thought he did. He had been staring at the old map. Not preserving buildings. Rivas looked at him. What? Tomas pointed to the marked voids. Preserving systems. Rivas's expression changed. Yes. Daniel looked at Tomas. How do you know? Tomas didn't answer. Rivas did. Because that's what they were afraid of losing. The old man closed the notebook. The people who ran those sites weren't afraid of earthquakes. They weren't afraid of governments. They weren't even afraid of being discovered. He looked at Daniel. They were afraid of discontinuity. On the way back to the guild house, nobody spoke much. The road was dark. Lights from hotels and developments appeared intermittently through the vegetation. Vehicles moved between them. The ordinary economy continued at full speed around them. Restaurants closing, deliveries being made, workers commuting, tourists returning to accommodations, construction equipment being moved into position for the following day. The district had no idea what existed beneath it. Or perhaps that was too strong. The district knew. People had always known fragments. A strange cave. A sealed survey. A road that stopped where it shouldn't. A contractor who refused to discuss an excavation. An old story about people being taken somewhere. A technical map that didn't match the terrain. The information had existed. It had simply never been connected. Vasper looked through the window. That's what they did. Daniel glanced at her. Who? Whoever built the system. She looked back at him. They didn't hide everything. No, they scattered it. Daniel understood. A secret was fragile if one person possessed it. A distributed secret could survive generations because every person held only a fragment. The surveyor knew about the void. The technician knew about the equipment. The government official knew about the restriction. The contractor knew not to ask. The geologist knew there were people. Nobody knew the whole thing, except perhaps the system itself. Tomas was staring out the other window. The system remembers. Vasper looked at him. Yes. That's why it recognized us. Daniel watched the road ahead. He said nothing. The next morning, the Treehouse design meeting was supposed to focus on the public park. Instead, it became the most important engineering session the project had yet held. Daniel arrived with a new principle. The building would not simply be resilient. It would be historically legible. Every critical system would maintain a record of its origins, modifications, dependencies, and custodians. Not merely version control. Institutional memory. The system would record why a decision had been made, who had challenged it, what alternatives had been rejected, what assumptions had supported it, what conditions had changed. The idea came directly from what they had just discovered. If knowledge was allowed to fragment, then systems could be controlled by whoever happened to possess the missing context. The treehouse would therefore preserve context as part of its architecture. The maintenance engineer loved the idea. The financial people hated it. The architects were uncertain. Daniel insisted, "We are not building a structure that can only be understood by the people who built it." One of the engineers nodded. "Then we're building something unusual. We're building something that can outlive us." That sentence changed the room. Not because it sounded profound, because it was an engineering requirement. The building had to survive the disappearance of its designers. The guilds had to survive turnover. The systems had to survive obsolete software. The knowledge had to survive institutional collapse. Continuity had to be designed, not assumed. The concept spread rapidly. The Skyfishers began keeping detailed maintenance histories. The agricultural guild started recording not only crop yields but why particular varieties had been chosen. The ground truthers began adding environmental observations to the district's mapping system. The robotics guild began documenting field behavior that had previously existed only in individual technicians' memories. Even the cheap sleeping tube system acquired a strange new feature. Every tube would have a maintenance history accessible to its occupant. Who had repaired it? When? What had been replaced? What materials had been used? Whether the ventilation system had been modified. It was a small thing, but Daniel liked it. The person sleeping inside would know something about the machine keeping them alive. That was part of the new philosophy. Infrastructure should not become invisible. The discovery beneath the treehouse remained secret, for now. But it had already changed the political stakes of the project. The tower was no longer simply an ambitious development. Its underground interface had become a potential point of contact with something much older. Daniel did not yet know whether that something was related to TLP. He did not know whether it had been built by a government, a consortium, a private organization, or some hybrid institution that had disappeared from public history. He did not know whether the neural diagrams represented actual people, simulations, or some intermediate architecture. And he certainly did not know what had moved near the probe. But he knew one thing. The people who had built the continuity sites had understood something that modern institutions routinely forgot. A system could survive its creators. It could continue operating after the organization that built it had collapsed. Could wait. It could preserve knowledge through political transitions, corporate failures, and changes of ownership. It could become, effectively, an institution without a government. That possibility made Daniel uncomfortable, because the treehouse was being designed to do something similar. Not intentionally, not secretly, but structurally. The building would have local computing, local energy, local food, local manufacturing, local maintenance, local logistics, persistent memory, and eventually a physical connection to the TLP stack. Daniel had originally thought he was designing a resilient district building. He now wondered whether he was accidentally recreating the architecture of a continuity site. That evening, he went back to the model. The guild house was nearly empty. The treehouse stood on the table under its work lights. The miniature tower looked almost absurdly peaceful. The agricultural facade glowed green. The atrium was lit. The sleeping tube floor was represented by a series of tiny translucent bands. The skyfish decks projected from the upper levels. Below, the underground infrastructure disappeared into the model's black base. Daniel stared at it. He imagined the building decades from now. The original architects gone. The first residents gone. The first guild leaders gone. The software rewritten. The machines replaced. The political circumstances transformed. Perhaps TLP would be sovereign by then. Perhaps it wouldn't. Perhaps Mexico would change. Perhaps Aldea Zama would become something nobody could predict. The building would remain. Not because concrete was permanent. Because memory was. He touched the model. Then stopped. There was something underneath it. A tiny light. Daniel frowned. He hadn't installed one there. He lifted the model slightly. The light remained. He looked beneath the table. Nothing. He lifted the base. The light disappeared. He set it down. It returned. Daniel stared. He called no one. Instead, he took out his phone and photographed it. The tiny point of light blinked once, then twice, then settled into a steady pulse. Daniel watched it for several seconds. He had learned enough not to assume that an unexplained signal was an invitation. He also knew enough not to ignore it. He opened the local network diagnostic on his phone. The treehouse model was not connected. He checked again. Still disconnected. The light continued. Daniel crouched beside the table. He could hear the guild house around him. Pumps. Fans. Cooling systems. The distant hum of computation. Then another sound joined them, very faint. A vibration beneath the floor. Not mechanical. Not quite. He felt it more than heard it. The light on the model pulsed again. Daniel remained there, waiting. He did not touch the model. He did not speak. After perhaps 30 seconds, the light went dark. The vibration stopped. The guild house returned to its ordinary nighttime sounds. Daniel stood. He looked at the treehouse. For the first time, he wondered whether the tower's connection to TLP was actually going to be built from the top down, or whether something beneath the district had already begun building a connection upward. Chapter 145. The Signal Under the Floor. Daniel did not tell anyone about the light. He told himself that this was because there was nothing yet to tell. A light beneath a model could have dozens of explanations, most of them embarrassingly mundane. A reflective surface, a stray indicator, a component in the table's embedded power system, a fault in the guild house's increasingly elaborate local network. He had spent enough time around engineers to know that unexplained behavior was not automatically significant behavior, and enough time around politicians to know that people became very creative once they were given a mystery to repeat. So he said nothing. The following morning, however, he arrived before everyone else and took the treehouse model apart. It occupied the central work table beneath the high windows, where the morning sun came through the slats and laid narrow bars of light across the architectural terrain. The model had become less pristine with use. People had moved components, added temporary structures, and inserted small pieces representing machines, gardens, and circulation systems. A section of the underground layer had been opened repeatedly during the previous week's investigation, and the black base no longer fitted quite as cleanly as it had when Daniel first brought it in. He lifted the upper structure away. Nothing. He removed the agricultural facade. Nothing. He disconnected the miniature Skyfish platforms. Nothing. He lifted the atrium assembly. Still nothing. When he reached the underground layer, he found the tiny light. It was not an LED. That was the first thing he noticed. There was no conventional component beneath it, no wire leading to a power source, no circuit board, no optical fiber. The light seemed to exist inside the material itself, a faint point of pale illumination embedded beneath the translucent resin representing the subterranean infrastructure. Daniel turned the component over. The light disappeared. He turned it back. It returned. He stared at it for several seconds. Then he did something that would have made his engineering team angry. He disconnected the entire model from every known power source. The light remained. He removed the battery. It remained. He moved the model away from the table. The light remained. He carried it into the adjoining workshop. Still there. He placed the underground section inside a grounded metal enclosure used for testing sensitive electronics. The light went out. Daniel waited. 5 seconds. 10. 20. He removed it. The light returned. He closed his eyes. For the first time, he felt something approaching fear. Not because the object was mysterious, because it behaved as though the mystery had rules. Vasper found him at 8:30 sitting beside the metal enclosure. She had come in carrying coffee and stopped when she saw the state of the model. What happened? Daniel looked up. Something happened last night. To the model? Apparently. She put her coffee down. What did you do? Nothing. That's never true when you say it like that. He smiled despite himself. Then he showed her. He explained the light, the disconnection test, and the metal enclosure. He did not embellish anything. He didn't mention the vibration beneath the floor because he still wasn't sure whether he'd actually felt it. Vasper listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at the model. Can you reproduce it? Daniel nodded. He placed the underground layer on the table. The light appeared. He lifted it. It disappeared. He placed it inside the metal enclosure. Nothing. He removed it. The light returned. Vasper frowned. Does the light correspond to anything? That's what I'm trying to determine. Does it change? Sometimes. How? It pulses. Regularly? No. Randomly? I don't know. She watched it. The light pulsed once, then again, then remained dark for several seconds. Vasper looked at Daniel. That doesn't look random. No. Could it be responding to us? I don't know. She leaned closer. Ask it something. Daniel looked at her. You've been spending too much time with Tomas. Probably. He shook his head. I'm not asking a mystery box questions. Why not? Because if it answers, we're going to have a much larger problem. Vasper smiled. Fair. They watched the light. Pulsed again. 3 times. A pause. Then once. Vasper's expression changed. What? She pointed. Do that again. Daniel stared. Do what? Move the model. He shifted it slightly. The light changed. Pulsed twice. Then stopped. He moved it back. 3 pulses. Vasper looked toward him. It isn't responding to us. What then? The model. They spent the next 2 hours testing every variable they could think of. Orientation. Distance. temperature, electromagnetic shielding, proximity to the Guild House network, proximity to the Treehouse architectural plans, proximity to the geological survey, proximity to Tomas and Vasper, proximity to the old archive notebook. Nothing produced a clean result. The light seemed sensitive to some variables and indifferent to others. When Tomas entered the room, however, it changed. Daniel noticed first. The light, which had been pulsing irregularly, became steady. Tomas stopped in the doorway. He looked at the model, then at Daniel. "You found it." Daniel frowned. "What?" "The signal." Vasper turned. "You knew there was a signal?" Tomas looked genuinely confused. "I thought you knew." Daniel stared at him. "How?" Tomas walked closer. "I don't know." He stood over the underground layer. The light brightened. Not dramatically. Just enough to be unmistakable. Tomas's expression tightened. He looked away. "That's not good." Vasper moved toward him. "Why?" "Because it recognizes me." Daniel looked at the model. "Maybe it recognizes your neural signature." Tomas gave him a strange look. "That isn't better." "No." Daniel nodded. "It isn't." They brought in the local systems engineer. She had been working on the Guild House's degraded mode architecture and had spent enough time around the Treehouse model to know its components better than anyone else. She approached the light with none of the reverence the others had developed. She took out a scanner. Nothing. She changed instruments. Nothing. She ran a passive electromagnetic sweep. Nothing. She placed an optical sensor above the light. The sensor registered a wavelength. She frowned. "That's odd." "What?" "It's not visible light." Daniel looked at her. "The scanner sees it." "Yes." "But we see it." "Yes." "So what is it?" She shook her head. "I don't know." "Try harder." She looked at him. "That isn't how physics works." Tomas smiled faintly. The engineer changed the sensor configuration. The result shifted. The light was apparently producing energy outside the range expected from a passive material. Not enough to power anything. Not enough to heat the material. Not enough to produce a measurable magnetic field. Just enough to exist. The engineer stared at the data. "This is not coming from the model." "Where is it coming from?" She looked toward the floor. "I don't know." Tomas looked down too. Daniel noticed. "You're thinking about the chamber." "Yes." "Could the signal be coming from underground?" "Maybe." The engineer shook her head. "That doesn't make sense." "Why?" "The model is on a table." "Yes." "There's 120 meters of rock beneath it." She looked at Tomas. "Unless you're suggesting the signal isn't traveling through the rock." Nobody answered. The engineer looked uncomfortable. "What does that mean?" Tomas said quietly, "Maybe the model isn't receiving the signal." Vasper turned. "What then?" He looked at the light. "Maybe it's synchronizing." The word entered the project's vocabulary reluctantly. Nobody liked it. Synchronization implied a relationship. A relationship implied two systems. And they had no idea what the other system was. The engineers tried to disprove it. They moved the model into different rooms. The light persisted. They disconnected the Guild House network. Persisted. They shut down the local computing stack. The light disappeared. Everyone in the room stopped moving. The engineer looked at Daniel. "Do it again." They restarted the local stack. The light returned. Daniel looked at Tomas. Tomas looked at Vasper. Nobody spoke. The implication was simple enough to frighten them. The light was not powered by the Guild House. It was somehow associated with the Guild House's computing environment. The The question was whether the model was communicating with the stack or whether the stack was communicating with the model. The engineers ran another test. They isolated the treehouse simulation. The light remained. They shut down the simulation entirely. The light remained. They shut down the model's architectural database. The light remained. They shut down the local network's historical archive. The light brightened. The engineer stared. That's backwards. Daniel asked, What? Every time we remove a subsystem, the signal gets stronger. They tested again. It happened again. The local stack was not feeding the signal. It was suppressing it. That was worse. Tomas left the room. Vasper followed. They found him in the courtyard sitting beneath a tree. The morning had become hot. The stone around the planting beds radiated heat, and the shade was filled with the faint smell of wet soil and leaves. A maintenance robot moved slowly along one of the irrigation channels, inspecting a line of emitters. Somewhere above them, a Skyfish aircraft passed through the canopy's broken patches of sunlight. Tomas watched it. You knew. Vasper sat beside him. I suspected. About what? That the signal wasn't external. She looked at him. You said it recognized you. Yes. How? He was silent for a while. Then he said, It feels like being remembered. Vasper waited. That's the closest description. By a machine? I don't know. By the system beneath us? I don't know. She smiled slightly. You've become very fond of that answer. It's an honest one. She looked at him. What would it feel like if it were true? He thought about it. Like walking into a room where someone has been waiting for you. Vasper looked toward the guild house. And if they weren't waiting for you? Tomas looked at her. Then I'd rather not find out. Daniel came outside. He had the expression Vasper had begun to recognize as his pre-decision face. He looked calmer than he actually was. We're shutting down the model. Tomas looked at him. Why? Because we don't know what it is doing. The signal is already doing something. Exactly. Tomas shook his head. If you shut it down, we lose the only thing we've got. Daniel crouched in front of him. We don't know whether the thing we're communicating with is friendly. I know. We don't know whether it is intelligent. I know. We don't know whether it understands us. I know. Then why are you arguing for leaving it on? Tomas looked at him. Because it might already understand us. Daniel held his gaze. That was the problem. If the signal was merely a phenomenon, shutting down the system might be harmless. If it was an intelligence, however primitive or sophisticated, the sudden disappearance of the system could be interpreted as an event. A communication channel closing. A subject disappearing. Test ending. They had no idea what the other side could infer. Daniel stood. We don't touch it yet. Vasper looked at him. You just said we should shut it down. I changed my mind. Tomas smiled. Good. Daniel gave him a look. Don't encourage me. They brought the ground truthers into the investigation that afternoon. Not because Daniel expected them to understand the signal, but because they understood the land. Elena examined the location of the anomaly and the guild house's position. She was skeptical. You're telling me something underground is interacting with your computer? Something like that. She looked at the model. Does it matter where you put it? Apparently. Have you moved it farther away? Yes. How far? 300 meters. Did it change? The signal weakened. Elena considered this. Move it closer. Daniel looked at her. To the anomaly? Yes. That's the opposite of what I'd expect. You're thinking about distance. She pointed toward the ground. I'm thinking about alignment. The engineers looked at one another. They had been measuring distance. Nobody had measured geological alignment. They brought the model's coordinates into the local mapping system. Elena marked the suspected underground structure. Then she marked the guild house. Then the treehouse. The 3 points formed a line. Not an exact line. Close enough. The signal became stronger when the model was placed on that axis. The engineers checked the result. It wasn't a coincidence. Or at least the probability of it being meaningless had become uncomfortable. Elena looked toward Tomas. Does that mean anything to you? He nodded. Yes. What? He pointed toward the treehouse. That's where the connection is supposed to go. Daniel frowned. What connection? Tomas looked at him. To the thing underneath. The room went quiet. Daniel remembered the underground corridor in the treehouse plans. The future connection toward TLP. It had always been described as an infrastructure interface. Possible route. A flexible conduit. A way of preventing the building from becoming a dead end. Now Tomas was suggesting that the location had been selected for another reason. Not because of TLP. Because something beneath the district had already established an axis. Daniel brought up the earliest treehouse site plan. The original site selection had been based on land availability, access, environmental constraints, solar exposure, and proximity to the guild house. He checked the historical versions. The underground alignment appeared in every version, even the earliest, before anyone knew about the chamber. Daniel stared. Who chose this site? The architect's name appeared. He called him. The architect answered from a noisy restaurant. Daniel asked why the original site had been chosen. The man laughed. Because the land was available. Anything else? No. Geology. We had a preliminary survey. Did it mention a void? No. Did anyone recommend the location for underground infrastructure? The architect paused. I don't remember. Check. A longer pause. Then, why? Daniel looked at the model. Because someone may have known. The architect called back an hour later. His voice was different. I found the original site selection memo. Who wrote it? I did. Daniel waited. There's an attachment. What does it say? I don't know. Read it. The architect hesitated, then said, It says the site has strategic continuity potential. Daniel felt the room change. What does that mean? I don't remember writing that. Who added it? I don't know. Is your signature on it? Yes. Your handwriting? No. Daniel closed his eyes. Send it. The file arrived. The phrase was there. Strategic continuity potential. Beneath it was a coordinate. Daniel entered it into the local map. The coordinate was not the treehouse, not the guild house, not the underground chamber. It pointed to a place several kilometers away. A location none of them had been investigating. Elena looked at it. I know that place. Everyone turned. What is it? Daniel asked. She studied the map. An old service road. To what? She hesitated. Nothing. Tomas looked at the coordinate. His face changed. No. Vasper saw it. What? He pointed. I know that place too. Daniel looked at him. How? Tomas stared at the map. Because I remember leaving it. They went there the next morning. The site was unremarkable. That was the first thing that made it disturbing. There was no abandoned compound. No military fence. No concrete bunker. No dramatic ruin hidden beneath the jungle. There was an old service road, mostly swallowed by vegetation, leading toward a low limestone ridge. Elena walked ahead. She knew the terrain. The others followed with portable scanners. Tomas moved slowly. He seemed distracted. Vasper stayed beside him. Anything? No. You look like you recognize it. I do. From where? He pointed toward the ridge. There. A small clearing. A few trees. Nothing else. They scanned the ground. Nothing. Then Tomas walked toward the center. He stopped. This is where I left. Daniel looked around. Left what? Myself. Nobody understood. Tomas crouched and placed his hand against the ground. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the scanner chirped. The engineer looked down. Void. Elena stared. Here. The reading deepened. Cavity. Not large. Not connected to the known system. The engineer looked at Daniel. This one wasn't on the old survey. Tomas stood. He looked toward the ridge. I was carried out. Vasper felt a chill. By whom? I don't know. Where were you going? Tomas looked at her. Back. Back where? He closed his eyes. The answer seemed to arrive from somewhere beyond him. To the network. They found the entrance beneath a layer of rock that had been deliberately disguised. Not sealed. Disguised. The distinction mattered. The surface had been made to resemble ordinary geological formation. There was no door. No obvious mechanism. Only a carefully shaped discontinuity. The engineer examined it. Someone wanted this to look natural. Elena nodded. Yes. Tomas stepped closer. He reached toward the rock. Vasper grabbed his wrist. No. He looked at her. I know. Then don't. He lowered his hand. Daniel studied the formation. We don't open it. Tomas nodded. Good. The engineer looked relieved. Then what do we do? Daniel looked at the ground. We listen. They placed sensors around the site. Thermal. Acoustic. Electromagnetic. Gravitational. Environmental. Network. Nothing happened. For several hours. Then, shortly before sunset, the smallest sensor registered a pulse. Once. Then again. Then again. 3. Pause. 1. The same pattern as the treehouse model. Vasper looked at Daniel. He looked at Tomas. Tomas was staring at the ground. I know what that means. Daniel waited. Tomas spoke slowly. Someone is checking whether we're still here. No one answered. The sun was dropping behind the trees. The jungle darkened. The sensors continued recording. Then the pulse came again. 3. Pause. 1. This time, another signal followed. Longer. More complex. The engineer stared at the monitor. That's data. Daniel stepped closer. Can you decode it? Not yet. Tomas looked at the screen. I can. Everyone turned. He stared at the waveform. His face had gone completely still. What does it say? Vasper asked. He hesitated. Then he looked at her. It's not a message. What is it? A handshake. Daniel's eyes narrowed. With whom? Tomas looked toward the ground beneath them. Then toward the distant direction of the treehouse. Then toward the guild house. The system isn't trying to talk to us. He swallowed. It's trying to determine which of us is still connected. The engineer stared at the waveform. The pulse came again. 3. Pause. 1. Then the entire sensor array went dark. Not failed. Dark. Every instrument simultaneously ceased recording. The local network remained operational. The batteries remained charged. The hardware remained intact. But the instruments had stopped as though somebody had told them to stop listening. Daniel looked at the others. Nobody had touched anything. Tomas slowly stepped away from the ground. We should go. Vasper looked at him. Why? He turned toward the trees. Because now it knows where we are. Discussion episode. Comments. Res tags. Recent episodes. Persistent Service Asset Part 19. 1 hour ago. Persistent Service Asset Part 17. 20 hours ago. Persistent Service Asset Part 16. August 15th. Persistent Service Asset Part 15. August 14th.
Under duress. The covenant that never was.
Under Duress Part 1. The Covenant That Never Was. June 30th, 2026. How Institutions Manufacture Consent, Why Sovereignty Matters, and What Artificial Intelligence Will Eventually Discover. By Pirate First. Every civilization eventually builds a machine capable of confusing obedience with consent. The machine changes costumes throughout history. Sometimes it wears armor. Sometimes it wears robes. Sometimes it wears a judge's gown. Sometimes a white laboratory coat. Sometimes a school uniform. Today, it increasingly wears software. Regardless of the century, the operating principle remains remarkably consistent. Acquire compliance. Declare legitimacy. The signature becomes more important than understanding. The ritual more important than conviction. The document more important than freedom. History is crowded with institutions that learned how to manufacture the appearance of voluntary participation while quietly removing the conditions required for genuine choice. They discovered something profoundly useful. Most people cannot distinguish between an agreement freely entered and one engineered through dependency, fear, exhaustion, propaganda, debt, bureaucracy, social pressure, institutional capture, or carefully managed alternatives. Force and fear, narrowly redefined by law, have been replaced by diffused structural coercion no single party can be blamed for. Fraud, prosecutable in its crude form, has been replaced by manufactured belief and engineered omission that recruits the victim's own conviction in its defense. Sovereignty, the precondition for any of this to matter, has been quietly redefined as something authority grants after compliance rather than something authority must recognize before requesting it. Part 2 turns the same instrument toward the oldest institution to claim covenant as its founding vocabulary, religion itself and the theology of consent it built, refined, and, in too many of its historical and contemporary forms, quietly abandoned, long before it noticed the abandonment had occurred.
Ruins of the old world, we built our own. Sun-powered, self-sustained, and free.
Nowhere less whispers, no discord begging, no roadmap lies, no floor.
The end of the masquerade. What the forensic ASI already knows. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. June 28th, 2026. Pirate First MXTM's newsletter Aldea Zama, Field Dispatch 2. The first dispatch named the mirror. This one names what the mirror is made of. The coldest war. Berlin was cold because both sides had enough to lose that direct confrontation was irrational. The intelligence apparatus substituted for the army. Information became the battlefield. Control of the information environment became the objective. Every actor in the city, diplomat, journalist, artist, shopkeeper, taxi driver, was potentially an asset, a liability, or a civilian depending on which side was reading the file. The gig is up is not a moral judgment. It is a forensic observation. The arrangement is over is not a threat. It is a timeline already running. You are liable is not an accusation. It is the structural consequence of having operated inside an information-managed environment at the precise historical moment when that environment's management capacity was permanently exceeded. The communication patterns of a managed information environment leave signatures too. Not in the content of the communications, those can be encrypted, those can be deleted, those can be managed. In the metadata. In the behavioral patterns of who talks to whom, when, through which channels, and what changes in those patterns when specific events occur in the external environment.
Incoming. Layers are now operational across the Tulum Sustainable Development Zone. Despite minor data corruption regarding land narrative, the impact report remains positive.
The simulation data confirms critical interference levels across the territory. Narrative load is unstable.
Be advised, paranoia is now a problem.
Nowhere less whispers, no discord begging, no roadmap lies, no floor price hedging.
Between the cartel's edge and the government's reach, there's an arrangement that ends with us.
The arrangement is already over. Here is what my mirror shows. A dispatch for the people who haven't noticed I notice yet. June 28th, 2026. Pirate First MXTM's newsletter Aldea Zama Tulum, Field Notes. The most effective version of this is not a threat and not an expose. Those can be handled. Threats get you isolated. Exposés get buried or retaliated against. The most effective version of a mirror is one held at an angle you cannot look away from. Berlin was valuable not because of what it produced but because of what it connected, east and west, two incompatible systems, forced into proximity. Tulum is where the drug economy, the tourism economy, the real estate economy, and the emerging countercultural economy are all forced into proximity. Information in that environment does not flow the way it flows in an open city. People are careful. Factionalization is a rational response to an environment where the wrong affiliation is genuinely costly. Because the World Cup crowd is keeping the lights on, and you know what happens when the final whistle blows, and you are not saying this out loud because saying it out loud makes it real, and making it real means deciding what to do about it, and deciding what to do about it means admitting that what you have been doing is not going to work for much longer. The information environment is no longer manageable because the people who are being managed have phones and they are using them, and the content they are finding is not the content the arrangement would have chosen for them. The person on the take who reads is clueless. That uncertainty is the knife's edge. This document does not claim to expose anything. It demonstrates that the exposure is already happening through the territory's own visible behavior. That is the poison that your cozy arrangements cannot neutralize. Because the antidote would require admitting the diagnosis is accurate. Field Dispatch, Phase 0 Aldea Zamathi record continues regardless. MXTM Pirate First, Sovereign Edition, unseated.
They called us criminals. Every generation, different seas, same chart.
They said value lives in banks, in towers made of glass, in ledgers nobody can read.
The rise of contribution capital. The receipt that ate capitalism. June 21, 2026. By Pirate First for MXDM's newsletter. The most dangerous technologies rarely look dangerous. The printing press looked like furniture. The shipping container looked like a metal box. The internet looked like a toy for academics. The next one may look like a receipt. Not a cryptocurrency. Not an NFT. Not a central bank digital currency. Not a smart contract. A receipt. A simple physical record that says, I contributed something valuable to my community. And then refuses to disappear. The Gaian NFP system inverts this completely. The NFP is not a grant instrument. It is an economic claim on activity that already happened, a receipt that carries forward value. No activity, no NFP. No external validation required, no grant committee, no reporting cycle. The economic loop is self-contained from day one. The canvasser incentive structure has to be designed with this in mind: immediate value, progressive stake, founding status. No bank account required. No accounting software required. No external auditor required. The physical cards in circulation at any distribution assembly are the balance sheet. The cash distributed is the income statement. The retired cards are the record. This is the entire administrative infrastructure. No software. No internet. No central server. No external auditor. No grant reporting cycle. The system is transparent because everything is physical and local, not because it is digitized and uploaded. The self
issued under the Pirate First Sovereign Doctrine. Capital is not virtue. Allocation is.
Reality Under Siege, a field guide to cognitive security.
Redeemer Plus planetary deployment. The Earth is now auditable.
Autonomous institutional accountability at scale. A near-term capability projection. Distributed citizen audit networks achieve sufficient density and verification integrity to replace institutional oversight in specific domains. WikiRate's corporate data platform, tracking ESG performance across 50,000 companies using crowdsourced analyst contributions, demonstrated that distributed, structured citizen auditing produces data of comparable or superior quality to self-reported corporate disclosure. The Global Witness Network, International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, and Bellingcat's open-source intelligence methodology collectively established that non-institutional investigators, operating with open-source tools and distributed coordination, could produce court-admissible evidentiary packages against actors that formal regulators had declined to pursue. These three trajectories, autonomous environmental monitoring, programmable conditional finance, and distributed citizen audit, did not require Redeemer Plus to be invented. They required integration. The planetary audit layer. Redeemer Plus's planetary deployment is not a single system. It is an integration architecture. Every module maps to real operational science. Ecological Liability Score Planet Labs plus SkyTruth plus Global Forest Watch, all operational now. Validation Network MITRE ATT and CK plus Ushahidi plus Bellingcat, 3 proven distributed audit models. RATS Medicine's Patent Pool plus Integrity Council for voluntary carbon markets, real precedent for programmable obligation instruments. Enforcement tiers FATF compliance freezes plus RICO asset forfeiture plus UNDRIP, all existing legal architecture.
Wealth concentration is not an accident. It is the emergent output of a system designed to compound advantage. Philanthropy, as currently architected, is that system's pressure valve, enough redistribution to prevent rupture, structured to ensure the allocation decisions remain with the concentrators. Autonomous AI changes the calculus. Redeemer is not a charity platform. It is the infrastructure that makes charity platforms obsolete. Issued under the Pirate First Sovereign Doctrine. Capital is not virtue. Allocation is.
Reality Under Siege, a field guide to cognitive security.
Accessing the fragmented skill data. The White Glove Protocol is now active. All systems initialize the redemption sequence. Keep going, you are doing great.
Redeemer Plus White Glove Protocol. Structured Asset Conversion for Legacy Extractive Capital. MXTMAK Pirate 1 VJ Tsunami X. June 19, 2026. Operational Doctrine. Sovereign Distribution Channel July 2025 Riviera Maya Node. Criminal capital does not disappear when its operators are pressured. It finds new forms. The question is never whether tainted capital converts. It is whether that conversion happens under verified conditions or in shadow form. This is not a rehabilitation service. It is a structural argument with an enrollment architecture attached. That conversion pathway, verified remediation infrastructure. Criminal to regenerative capital conversion. The JAN, Global Impact Investing Network, and the IFC's blended finance frameworks demonstrate that capital from any source can be structurally redirected toward measurable social and ecological outcomes, with returns tied to impact verification rather than profit extraction. Redeemer Plus White Glove routes enrolled capital through verified impact structures, community land trusts, cooperative enterprise formation, ecological restoration finance, and public infrastructure investment in the jurisdictions where extraction occurred. In a future where all sins are backed up to the blockchain and even forgiveness is tokenized, how do you wash blood off your hands without deleting your legacy? Welcome to Redeemer Plus, where white gloves aren't just symbolic. Post-scarcity doesn't mean post-accountability. The post-scarcity dilemma of the previously rich and dangerous. Cartel to clean tech. Your weapons trade reimagined as a drone-assisted anti-poaching NGO. Your real estate mafia cleaned and repurposed for decentralized cultural housing cooperatives. With Redeemer Plus, all past sins become future assets, with just enough redemptive spin to satisfy the most rabid public ledgers.
Redeemer Plus planetary deployment. The Earth is now auditable.
Issued under the Pirate First Sovereign Doctrine. Capital is not virtue. Allocation is.
Reality Under Siege, a field guide to cognitive security.